Many people dream of fame, of fortune, and of celebrity. That idea of being in the public eye, of being known and having the bankroll behind you to prove that you truly are successful. Very few of us probably consider some of the downsides. The fact that being rich and famous can put a bit of a target on your back. How secure can you really feel day to day if millions of people know who you are and how much you're worth? Plenty of celebrities pay good money for security for this very reason, to protect themselves from either attackers or just overzealous fans. But how many do you think really worry about getting kidnapped? And do you think that a celebrity could ever be kidnapped and ransomed without the mainstream news or police ever being made aware? Well, if certain sources are to be believed, to find the answer to that question, we need to go back to 1993 and speak to a certain up-and-coming power couple of the celebrity world, Bobby Brown and Whitney Houston. Before we get to kidnappings, alleged or otherwise, it might be a good time to consider your own safety, online at least. And that's where today's sponsor, Atlas VPN, comes in. You can use my link in the description below to pick up your subscription to Atlas VPN for the rock-bottom price of $1.70 a month for 3 years. And it even comes with 6 extra months free and a 30-day month-back guarantee. You can never be too careful online. And Atlas VPN can not only provide you with anonymity on the internet, it also stops malware and ads. Not only that, but it will notify you if something or someone is trying to steal your data. In researching a lot of these topics, I come across news articles or information that is region locked. That is not an issue with Atlas VPN. With a quick click, I can set my location to wherever it needs to be and gain instant access to all that information. It also works for streaming services like Netflix, where I can update my location and access new catalog of shows that might not be available where I am. With this deal, you can protect an unlimited amount of devices and also ensure you are getting the best deals whenever you're shopping for anything online. So click the link down below and start protecting yourself online for the low price of $1.70 a month for over 3 years with 6 months extra for free. And now, back to Bobby and Whitney. Bobby Brown had been a member of New Edition, now said to have been the template for the classic boy band. They had numerous hits and released 3 albums between their formation in 1978 and when Bobby left in 1985 to pursue his solo music career. Bobby released his first solo album, but it was the second, named Don't Be Cruel, released in 1988, that really strapped a rocket to his back. He had a #1 song, 5 top 10 hits, and a Grammy win under his belt in short succession. At the 1989 Soul Train Awards, he met Whitney Houston, and it was clear from the start that the two were infatuated with each other. Whitney was already an internationally known star by this point. She had multiple, even successive #1 songs under her belt, as well as album sales that were through the roof. Her second album had a record-breaking 4 #1 tracks on it, beating out her debut, which itself had 3. Both albums had sat at #1 in the charts for weeks at a time, in countries all over the world, and it was clear that her star was only destined to get brighter from here. It would be only 3 years after meeting that the pair would get married, and only one more for their daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, to be born. Truly, from the outside at least, it looked like a whirlwind romance, but all was not well between the two lovebirds. Brown had a reputation as a bit of an unstable character, already beginning to rack up a list of charges and issues due to his drug use and erratic behavior. And with him, Whitney's sparkly clean public image began to fade a little. The two had well-publicized drug and booze-fueled tiffs that were eaten up by the tabloids. It's a little surprising, then, that somewhere in the Bronx, a particularly ruthless crew were about to plan an audacious crime and stay out of the headlines. The Preacher Crew was headed up by a mountain of a man called Clarence Heatley. Born in 1953 and standing an imposing 6 foot 7 inches tall, his incredible size was somehow the least scary thing about him. Growing up in Harlem, New York, he was involved with crime from a young age, being sent to juvenile detention before the age of 10. By the early 80s, Clarence was known as Preacher, had already circled himself with men who were as cunning, ruthless, violent, and power-hungry as he was. Together, they began to sell enormous amounts of mainly cocaine in New York City, but they were known to dabble in other drugs. It wasn't the drugs that made the crew so renowned, however. It was the way they dealt with competition and debtors. Clarence and the men that ran with him swore him endless loyalty and would do whatever it took for the success of their organization, were famed for using kidnapping, torture, and dismemberment to try and recover old debts. They were known to cut off fingers, toes, and other body parts to either get their victims to hand over cash or encourage their loved ones to pay ransoms. And they were not above committing murder to protect what was theirs and eliminate those who would try and take it away from them. Their infamy grew even more when they kidnapped a 12-year-old boy, sent his fingers back to his family, and ended up killing him in cold blood anyway. The bottom line was, Clarence Preacher Heatley and his crew were not to be taken lightly. A former member of the gang known as David Collins would later reveal in a book one of the more surprising stories of a crime that Preacher crew committed that should have made headlines the world over, but didn't. Bobby Brown had run up an alleged drug debt that was somewhere in the region of $25,000 to someone in Atlantic City. Preacher essentially bought the debt, paying it off, and then deciding that Bobby now owed a vastly inflated sum to him and his crew. And the Preacher crew were not a group that you wanted to owe money to, famous or not. They knew that Bobby hung out in a nightclub in Manhattan, and 3 of them went there to intercept him. Sure enough, he was there and they gave him some high-grade cocaine. Once he had sampled the goods, of course he wanted to buy more off them, and they got him to follow them to an apartment deep in the Bronx with the promise of more drugs to purchase. Instead, once he was up on the 5th floor, they overpowered him, pointing weapons at him and punching him when he made an attempt to escape. They tied him up in hand and foot and stuffed rags in his mouth so that he couldn't scream. Preacher finally made an appearance, looming large in the room, probably the absolute last thing that Bobby Brown wanted to lay eyes on. Bobby pleaded for his life. He begged, he swore up and down that he was good for the money. He promised that Whitney would happily pay whatever was needed to see him freed. Charles left Bobby alone again for a few hours, leaving his underlings to continue harassing and threatening him. They even suggested at one point that they would kill Whitney as well as him. Through it all, Bobby begged and pleaded for his life and repeated over and over that his wife would pay whatever it took. They just needed to phone and ask. So, finally, after multiple hours of threats and intimidation, the crew made the call to Whitney Houston to explain the situation. They set out the facts. They had a man. He owed them a lot of money, and what they would do to him if the money didn't appear. So what did Whitney Houston, award-winning singer and celebrity, do? Did she call the cops? Did she send her security over to make a rescue? Did she try and call in some favors? No. If the accounts set out in this book are accurate, then Whitney herself hand-delivered a bag with $400,000 in cash. She had the foresight to wear a wig and dark glasses in order to hide her true identity. But she went there in person, strolled right on into that apartment in the Bronx, handed over the ransom, and left with her husband, all without the authorities or the press ever being any the wiser, at least for the next few years. As with everything else in life, no action is without consequences. For Clarence Preacher Heatley and his Preacher crew, although the police weren't made aware of this particular incident, they had been putting themselves on the map with similar stunts a little too much. All the high-profile kidnappings, robberies, and violence, not to mention the ludicrous amounts of drugs that were being shifted by the crew, soon caught the attention of local law enforcement. The FBI and NYPD set up a special task force to take down the crew, which by this point they suspected had been involved in more than 40 killings. Over the next few years, prominent members of the Preacher crew found themselves arrested, and one by one, they started to provide information for a more lenient sentence. Clarence's right-hand man, John Cuff, was arrested, and Preacher himself followed soon after, being arrested on July 15, 1996. The pair both got plea bargains to avoid the death penalty, but instead were sentenced to life imprisonment. Preacher is still alive in the prison system of the U.S. in Florida and will currently be 70 years old. As for Bobby and Whitney, their lives would continue to be intertwined for years after the kidnapping and ransom. But it's fair to say that not all of them were happy years. The relationship was tumultuous, to say the least, with Bobby Brown being charged with committing domestic violence against Whitney on several occasions. Both were still using drugs to varying degrees, and the volatile and unhappy relationship finally came to an end in 2007, after they had been married for 15 years. It would be only 5 years after this, in the year 2012, that Whitney would be found dead in her bathtub, with the cause of death being attributed to both heart disease and the use of cocaine. Whitney and Bobby shared a daughter together, Bobby Christina Brown, born 1993, and she would pass away in 2015, a mere 3 years after her mother's death. She too was found unconscious in the bathtub. Bobby Brown is married to his manager, Alicia Etheridge Brown, and has been for more than a decade now, having fathered 7 children in total over the years, as well as losing Bobby Christina in 2015. One of his sons, Bobby Jr., died of a drug overdose. Maybe being famous isn't all it's cracked up to be. While it is surreal to imagine Whitney Houston walking into a trap house with nearly $500,000 in cash, nothing more than a wig and sunglasses to protect her, it doesn't seem like anyone in the situation ended up truly happy. None of the people that ever crossed Preacher did, that's for sure, and neither did he or his boys, who are either serving lengthy jail terms or dead. Out of the main players in the kidnapping, Clarence is serving life, Whitney is dead, and Bobby is a father who has lost 2 children. Whatever can be said about the relationship that Bobby and Whitney had, whatever faults and flaws were exhibited during their many years together, the kidnapping we've looked at today covers more of it than you would expect. Sure, it has the elements we already knew, the excessive drugs, the risk-taking, Bobby Brown getting into trouble, Whitney being dragged down with him. But it also shows that at least for a while, there was clearly something strong between them, a relationship that was worth risking injury and death for. One that paying $400,000 to salvage and continue seemed more than worthwhile. And it may be easy to look back at the beatings, the excesses, the tabloid headlines, and the tragic deaths of Whitney, Bobby Christina, and Bobby Jr. Maybe in this fairly surreal snippet from somewhere deep in the Bronx, we can see what was once good between them both.